Yeah, so hi everyone. Super excited to have everyone here and people that are coming back. Just want to welcome you guys to Coding for Beginners. This is the introduction to HTML and CSS. And this is going to be part 2 of how to build the memory game. I believe we touched on the Simon game last week. Yeah, and my name is Tim Tran. I'm a product marketer at Flatiron School, and today I'm filling in for Corey Nicholson. Part of this evening's workshop event is to give you a feel for Flatiron School's experience and introduce you to our wonderful instructors. And then for a quick reminder, we will use the chat as our main source of communication tonight. So be sure to change that little blue box in the chat function from host and panelists to everyone so we can, yeah, all chat together. And then both Samuel and I will monitor the chat and help you along the way with this workshop. And without further ado, I want to introduce you to our amazing lead software engineer instructor, Samuel. All right, cool. Take it away.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Like I said, welcome back for anyone who tagged in from last week, and welcome for anyone joining us for the first time. What we started off last week was designing our very own Simon game. Let me just screen share real quick, get folks caught up to speed a little bit. Awesome, cool. Let me just maybe move myself over here to the other screen so y'all can see as much as possible. So we know our goal is to get something looking a little bit like one of these that we got here. Where, well, not as detailed with like the 3D and the speaker and whatnot, but mainly the color scheme that we have going in each one of these. And so far where we're at is we have each of these pieces showing up here. So I'll do a little bit of a quick recap just to highlight where we were last at. And then what I'll recommend is feel free to code along if you already are situated with everything. If you are just joining for the first time, I would highly recommend to watch, have some fun, throw stuff in the chat, and then you can catch the part 1 recording to get up to where this is at. And then once this recording is out as well, then you can pick back up from there so you can get each piece of everything. There also will be a portion where we'll be moving more into the JavaScript portion of everything. There's going to be some new concepts. I'm going to try to explain and extrapolate these concepts as expediently as possible. If there is a point where folks feel like maybe they are getting a little bit jumbled or confumbled, as I like to say, with some of the JavaScript concepts, it's okay. Like I said, feel free to take a pause and watch what's happening, because these concepts are concepts that kind of stack upon one another, but do the best you can as well. Because remember, we're just getting started on this. So let me just check the chat as well before we get going. Hi, for part 1 recorded, would you be able to share the link? Oh, I appreciate it. Look at the, come on, look at the chat helping each other out. This is amazing. Awesome. Cool. But like I said, again, feel free to continue to join and participate. If you do have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll do my best to monitor the chat while keeping us up to speed with everything it is that we're going through. But like I said, everything it is that we're seeing is in the chat. So drop any questions you have in there so we can follow up with you. Awesome. I see folks sharing that video. Can you remind us how to create a new window to run the code? So we're here in the REPL.it site. Let me see if I can do a new incognito window and then just look up REPL.it.com so I can give you all the base URL to this website. This is the site that we're using, and if you click start coding, it will prompt you to either make a quick account or link to GitHub or Google or your Facebook account if you want to use that as well. So I'm just going to go back and drop this in the chat. And I see folks helping each other out in the chat as usual. I love to see it. So again, that is the site that we are using. If you have your code base from last time, for you to continue, and if not, then feel free to at least get your account set up and kind of like pace it with yourself. But again, please, folks, don't beat yourselves up. Be kind to yourself if it feels like things aren't working or things aren't moving at the exact pace that you would like them to. Just a reminder that every amazing website that it is that you see, every game it is that you ever play was not built in a day. So remember to pace yourselves in that process. And again, I've been doing this for a little bit. So remember, whatever it is you're able to accomplish, it's okay. And then from there, you can kind of take it a little bit more at a pace on the side of the recording as well. So I'm just going to do a quick recap of where we were last at, because there's some concepts that are super important, as well as concepts that we're going to continue to stack upon. Just need to swipe over to my notes and then reopen the Zoom chat on this side and the participants on the other side as well. Cool. So a couple key things to remember. We're working in this trichotomy of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So we primarily were focusing on our HTML and CSS. Last time, I'm just going to open up each of these files here on the side so we can see it. And actually what I'll do is I'm just going to refresh the page. I know some folks did have the question about how it is that I got the stuff open on the side. So I'm just going to recap that a little bit. So I'm just going to refresh the page so everything kind of resets itself. Give it some time. Cool. Awesome. So as soon as you get a new Replit code base situated, you're going to see that you have like a small simulation window here on the side. And then you're going to see that you have your files here as well. If you click on these sheets of paper, we can kind of toggle them to show up and to disappear. I try my best to just maximize the space so that y'all can see the code, excuse me, as we're working on it. So what you'll notice me do is just drag these files. So we see here index.html, I dragged it over there. The script.js is here, and then the CSS sheet, I'm just going to drag it up here as well. So we have all three. And then after that, I just kind of collapse the sidebar here a little bit. And then this simulation screen that's here, every time you make a change, you can click play to kind of refresh it or see it showing up. But because I want to show y'all as much code as possible, you're going to notice that I click on this here to open it a new tab. And once I get that link, this is actually what I have open just in another browser on the side. So if you're using a browser that has the ability to have multiple tabs, you can just drag it out to the side and then resize it yourself. That's how I got this on the side there. So, and that's what I pretty much have there on the right side of the screen. And once I set that up, all I did was just use this bar here to kind of hide this that we have showing up here so that we can see all of the code possible. So from here, anytime we make a change, what we're going to pretty much do is just refresh the page so that we can see that show up. Sometimes it takes a little bit of some time for it to reconfigure itself. And then if you do have the screen open here on the side, like I said, anytime you make a change, if you want to see that change, you can either refresh that here, or you can click the play button again and it will do the same thing. If folks do still have that oblong oval from last week, that's okay. I was so tempted to go and adjust it, but I'm like, no, we got to pick up from the exact same place. I don't want to change anything. So I left it exactly as it was so that we can all be at the same place together. And as well, feel free to follow along and soak up the knowledge of what is that we're talking about here today, and then catch up on everything all together, the first part and today's part, so that you see how it is that we're making all this magic happen. So remember, we have our HTML file here. We talked about our head tag last week. This is where all the information that our HTML file needs to know about exists. The main place we're actually working is in the body tag here. So in our body tag, we have this H1, which we know is associated to this title here for the Flatiron game. We have this H2, which is associated with the actual score that's here. And then we have these divs that we know we're styling to become our other game pieces. So we have this div, which again, div is just shorthand for something that's dividing up space and kind of sectioning off what that space is. And then I'm about to take us to our CSS sheet real quick, just as a reminder of how we got them styled as such. So each of these divs has an ID, which we know is a unique identifier. And each of these are then assigned to something that we just decided to create. And for readability, we named each one of them the associated color. But just as a reminder, if you're just tagging in, this is not what's actually making the color be red or green or blue. These are just unique identifiers so that when we connect with them from our CSS sheet, we actually can then make them each one of those colors based upon how we're styling it. So folks probably have the memory from last week of me making the analogy of whenever you're making an application with HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, we're putting on a show. So the HTML is the stage as is. The CSS is how we decorate the things that are on the stage and make them a little bit more interactive, make them flash, like we'll see a little bit of today as well. And then our script tag is actually like the script that our actors will read. But in this case scenario, our script is what our compiler is going to read to then make the actions happen as we would as we're going through things. So our interactivity is in our JavaScript. Our styling and presentation is in our CSS, and our HTML is exactly how we want things to show up as they load. So from there, we go to our CSS. In our CSS sheet, we started styling each part of this. Remember that our body tag is where everything that's actually going to show up here is. And then we just chose a background. Y'all taught me last week that this is pronounced bisque and not bisque, and I appreciate that. We're teaching each other something. And then this text align center is just centering everything that's on the page. Here we styled specifically our H1, and then here we styled our H2. And if you remember, we have these unique identifiers, and I gave you all that mnemonic, that reminder that, let me get the little annotation out so I can draw on the screen again. Remember that we have our IDs, and then we have our classes, and those are the ways that we select our HTML elements so we can style them. And remember, I told y'all last week that we can remember this because our IDs start with an I, and they use the hashtag symbol, like we see over here. And the reminder I gave y'all is we can turn this capital I into a hashtag if we're ever forgetting what we use for each one of those selectors. And then on the latter side, we know that our classes use that dot. And the way I always say to remember that is that C is wrapping around, sorry, that didn't take two. Our C is wrapping around that dot. So these are important concepts that we're going to need, especially when we start our JavaScript, because our JavaScript is going to be selecting these elements as well, based upon either their class or their ID. Let me just clear the screen real quick. And each one of these sections here between each one of these curly braces, remember, is just referring to each one of the stylings that we have set up. So this position relative that we have on our game board is actually important and is going to help us as we reposition it and make sure that it's not just like an oblong oval. And so that everything else is going to be relative to relatively positioned to the game board itself. Remember, this is changing the actual background color. This is what we chose for our height. And as I'm noticing now, we actually didn't give this a width. So, sorry, let me do that a little bit slower. So give it a width. And if we give it a width of 500 pixels, and now if we either click the play button, if you still have the screen open on the side, or if you refresh the page itself, now it should be a round circle and not an oblong oval. Because I was forgetting that I only did the height, which made it 500 pixels, but then it stretched itself all the way to either end, so it looks more like an oval. So when we actually changed it to a width now and a height of 500, we can imagine it's more square-like and more balanced. Then our border radius is actually what's making it round. If I comment this out real quick with the command / button, and then I refresh the page again over here, we see that it's just a square. So what it is that we're actually, I see folks are very enthused to know that it's a dot. What it is that we're doing with our CSS, like I said, is we're taking things as they might have just been shown on the stage by default, and we're decorating them a little bit. So we took this square and we used the 100% border radius to round out the edges of the square and make it into a circle. There's a lot of modeling that you can do with these shapes and these divs in a lot of very intricate ways. Some of what we're going to be doing is using these simple shapes to then kind of create overlays to create the presentation that we want at the end here. So just a quick reminder, again, this is how we got the height and the width for each one of these pieces, and the background color for each one of these pieces, and the border radius for each one of these pieces as well to be rounded. Something else that I realized as well, once this all gets wrapped like this, with that flex wrap functionality, let me scroll up to the top. So here on the game board, I did this display flex, which is actually what's making it show up horizontally and not vertically. If I comment this out as well with the command / button, or if you're on Windows, control / you can use that to comment stuff in and out so that the code compiler is either going to read it or not read it. So if I refresh, look at how the shapes are now going more vertical. But when we turn on our flex wrap, that actually makes the shapes wrap in line. This is going to be a key part of what's going to help us in getting everything into its correct position. So if I refresh this now, everything is going horizontal. And I see folks dropping some knowledge in the chat as well and sharing insights with one another. Like I said as well, to keep time, I'm going to keep moving through everything and just make sure, oh, can I repeat flex wrap? So flex wrap is pretty much what's causing this to be flexible and wrap itself around so that the things would actually kind of start to go in rows. Let me see if I can actually make this a little bit smaller. Yeah, it's as small as that it's going to go. So we're not going to actually see it wrap any further. But if I kept consolidating it, we'd see it wrap a little bit more there. But nonetheless, it's creating that process of, instead of things just going as they are on the stage from top to bottom in the HTML file, for them to wrap and take up the horizontal space as well, and then make their way over. Yeah, I'm noticing that the circle is a little bit off to the side, and I made this joke last week as well. One of the most difficult things that you'll ever do as a developer is center a div. And that's always like a running joke that we have going, because sometimes you'll put all of the correct code to position something in the center and it won't center. So in this case, we see that I aim to do that with the text align center so that everything should center itself. That is a subsidiary of the body, which is where everything is on the page. And we got our text align center as well. So this would usually then reflect for everything in the body in of itself, but it's not also reflecting for our circle shape. So I'm just going to try to take that and bring it over to our actual game board and do text align on that. And if I refresh, let's see if it centers itself, and it does not. So let me just refresh exactly how it is that I positioned it previously. Yeah, I believe last, the text align center took everything to the center in of itself. So I'm just cross-referencing here on the side from when I did the original base design of everything. So we have our text align center, we have our semicolon, we're not missing anything here. And here is the entire body. And then if we go to our actual game board, we have our position relative, our width, and oh, I believe what we're missing is our display inline block on the body. That's what I didn't put in there. So if I go over to the page and I go to our, where are we at, our inspect, or however it is that, depending on which browser you're using, that you get your developer tools so that you can actually see what's going on in the console. if we go to the console part, because this we're actually going to need a little bit, but if we take this little hover piece like I showed y'all last week, we can actually see what's going on here. And if I kind of hover over this circle, we see that there's a little extra rectangle next to it. So this is some of the helpfulness of seeing where everything is actually positioned and laid out. And what we want to actually do is remove that excess space on the side. And we can do that with a command called in relation to our display inline block. So fingers crossed, I refresh the page. That's so interesting. It should be getting rid of any excess space. Let me hover over it. Yeah, it's still showing up here. Let me refresh one more time now. Maybe it's a little bit delayed. That is so interesting. And then let me play on this page as well. We know that this is the exact same page that we've been working because we just adjusted our oval. We know that our game board is here. Super interesting. I'm going to keep connecting all of the other pieces to one another, and then hopefully I'll come across what it is that might be throwing us awry here and not centering the game piece. So I took out the text align center. Let me try to put the text align center back in. Text align center. And refresh. I'm out of bank. Same deal. Game board, display inline block. What is this saying? Can I use duplicate style definitions? Oh, because we have our display flex over here as well. This should not give us a problem prior to. Okay, that is exactly what's happening here. So each one of these display properties are actually clashing with one another. And as I'm reflecting on this as well, I'm remembering that we're intending to start off with this flex wrap, but then we're eventually going to position each one of these sections in a separate way. So we have our green, our red, our blue, our black, our yellow, our circle illusion, which we're gonna tag in a little bit. And then we should be able to position each one of our pieces as well. Cool. So let me comment out this display flex and this text align center really quickly. And now let me refresh. Cool. And now we got our circle centered, but our pieces are vertical again. So we'll regroup all of those in a little bit. Something key we're going to need to do here in our HTML is actually create two different sections themselves as well. So currently, if we go to our HTML file, we have one div wrapping everything, and that's called the game board in of itself. So that game board is wrapping all four of our pieces, and what we actually want to create is a separate div to divide the top pieces and the bottom pieces in of themselves, so that we can style those a little bit differently and wrap those a little bit differently as well. Because we see that our display for our inline block is what's going to allow us to remove all that excess space. We see there's no extra rectangle anymore on the side there. But if we do that, then we can't do our display flex for each of our individual pieces. On top of that as well, it's going to help us to create another div for our top pieces and another div for our bottom pieces so that we can style those accordingly as well. So remember, all of this is being contained by our entire div here. This ends on line 42. So that's that line 41, that's that last div here. So we're just going to make another set of separate divs to divide up the top and the bottom pieces. And then we're going to kind of see how that starts to come together as well there. So I'm going to create an opening div and a closing div tag here. Whoops, I hit space too early. Cool. And then I'm going to give this a unique identifier of top row. So I'm going to say top dash row. And then I'm going to now put my red piece and my green piece in this top row. So you can either copy and paste and then move it over there yourself and then hit delete, or we can actually do as well as a cut and paste, because we're taking this exact same code and bringing it here. And now I'm just going to indent this a little bit so that we see the things matching up that need to match up. Just by hitting tab to indent that. And now we have our red piece and our green piece on a separate top row. And now we're going to do the same for our bottom pieces. So I'm going to create a div here, a closing div for this. We're going to space this out and put our other tags in between. And then I'm going to put a unique identifier on this one. I'm going to call it bottom dash row. I might have done that a little bit fast. I used the keyboard command Control X or Command X, depending. Control X if you're on Windows, Command X if you're on Mac, just so I can do a cut and paste just like I did manually. And now if I come here and paste, REPL wants to see images. Okay, that's all right. It's got a prompt from the REPL website that has said if we are copying and pasting images, it wants to know about it. So I just confirmed that. And now I'm going to indent that as well. Cool. And now if you refresh, that's not literally necessarily going to resolve everything completely, but now we kind of see there's a separate grouping for our top row and a separate grouping for our bottom row here. So we can kind of start to position them in their necessary ways as well. So we tag into here, we should have a style for our top row and bottom row. And that might be where it is that we would do any display adjustment so that these can wrap together. So just display align block. We got that for our game board. We're looking good. It's working well. Awesome. 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 Cool. So we have our top row and our bottom row. And just first make sure here, game board. Awesome. Lock shadow. We'll get to that shortly. We have our colors. Awesome. 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 Cool. Circulusion. We're gonna do a line block for that as well. Cool. So let me go to our CSS style sheet and let's try to create an actual group as well for our top row and bottom row so that we can position everything that should be showing up inside of it as well. Color blue, color red, color yellow, color green. We have our display position, display inline block for the game piece, size and details. That's actually what it is that we're missing. Now I see exactly what it is that we're missing there. So we have each of our separate game pieces here in our styling. So we have our hashtags for the IDs of each one of the things on here. But what we actually haven't tagged into yet, and this makes a lot more sense as well now, also, we haven't put any classes on any of our HTML elements. And the class that we're actually going to use, so again, we kind of think, yes, I'm remembering now, it's ringing a bell. IDs are unique identifiers. So I was wondering, we don't have any class on here. Our classes are things that we can kind of group together. So for example, if you're in the software engineering class, or you're in the data science class or anything of that sort, you're being grouped together because you're working on the same thing. So IDs are unique identifiers, but our classes are things that we might want to style the same way, regardless of what they actually are. So what we're gonna do for each one of our game pieces, we know that we want this ID of color red, so things have to do with the red piece are unique to the red piece. But eventually we're gonna want all of these pieces to not only position themselves, but to kind of start to behave very similarly as well. So what we're gonna do here in this div, I'm just gonna hit enter in my bottom caret. And then I'm going to write class equals. And then here I'm going to create a new class called game piece sizes and details, because, oh, sorry, I misspoke. Because all of this is going to determine the commonalities between each of our game pieces. So I'm going to say game dash piece sizes and details. So anything that has to do with the commonalities between our game pieces, I'm going to make sure that shows up for all of the game pieces. So if I go over to the next div, I'm just doing a copy and paste. So we have our bottom row section here. And then I'm just going to hit enter on this and then paste that as well. So I'm just using the keyboard command V to paste, or Control V if you're on Windows. Same deal there. Cool. So we have it on our yellow piece div, we have it on our blue piece div, our green piece div, and our red piece div. So it looks like we're making good pace there. Again, just a reminder that this is not yet what's going to make everything position themselves, but we're working our ways up to it. So now that we know we have a class, like I refreshed at the beginning of everything, if we go to our style sheet, we need to now create a actual class for each one, well, for this styling group, the styling class that we called game piece sizes and details. So similar to how we created each one of these, and let me just refresh and see if I put it above. Cool. Yeah, so we're going to drop this above. We're going to go to wherever it is that your game board section in your CSS is ending. And then if we hit enter in here, I'm just going to say dot, because remember, we're going to refer to that class that we just created here for each one of these pieces. We'll copy that, bring it over here, paste that, just so we make sure it matches exactly. Feel free to type it yourselves, but y'all saw me misspell class a couple minutes ago. So I'd rather probably copy and paste it rather than try to type this myself, because it has to match one for one in order for the selectors to match properly. So after we give this a name, we do our open and closing curlies. I'm just going to hit enter to space it out, and we're going to start to write the details inside of here of how we want each one of these commonalities to present themselves. So in here, what we're going to do is a display of inline block for each one of these game pieces. So it's gonna move this annotation screen here, little zoom floaty bar, and refresh. And look at that. We got our pieces now positioning themselves. So if I'm just going to comment this out just to recap a little bit. If I refresh, we had each one of these things positioned here as they were. And if we look, like I was telling you, you see all that excess light orange rectangle space. That's all of the space that that div is containing. Even though it's just that little red shape or that little green shape, it actually is taking up the space of itself and the entire row. When we do our display inline block, it is going to remove that extra block there on the side, so that now if we refresh the page, we look and it's actually only containing each one of those individual pieces. So we're getting a little bit closer each time. From here, we start to realize that, okay, we got the top and the top left and top right piece correct. But now we need our bottom left and bottom right piece to be correct. So if we go over to those unique pieces styling sections, we'll start to realize, okay, this yellow piece now is showing up on the right side. So instead of us changing the bottom left radius, which we know is this lower left-hand corner here, we want to change its actual bottom right radius. So I'm just going to change that from left to right. In this case, this actually is making a change because this is the keyword that refers to the detail of that property. So I'm going to say bottom right radius. And now here, if I refresh, we see it starts to round out a little bit now. We're getting closer and closer, folks. Give ourselves a round of applause. And again, if your code is still maybe an oval or anything like that, that is completely okay. Just a reminder that we're recording this so that you can tag in and run it back and get a little bit more detail. Is trying to keep as much pace as possible so that we can get over to some of the JavaScript functionality here. So from here, we can translate that. We know we want the blue piece now. We want the bottom left radius now to be rounded out. So I'm going to change that right to left. And now if I come in here and refresh, we're getting closer and closer, folks. Woo! So next up, we see that we need to position each one of these pieces a little bit more. So with that being said, is where we can tag into what we did from the beginning, where we set up a position relative on that actual game board portion here. That's so that anything contained in that game board or anything that is any tag that is presenting itself between that game board as well is going to be positioned relative now from the game board. Remember, the game board is actually that black circle in the background. So now our other pieces are going to position themselves relative to that. So if I scroll back down now to the section we're just working on, talking about where our game pieces and size details are showing up, what we want to actually do here is start to use the position of these pieces all grouped together relative to the actual circle themselves. So what we're going to do is type our position relative here. And now we get to adjust how far they are. So if y'all remember, a little bit of the humor that I threw in from last week is anytime you're doing any CSS styling, pick an extreme color or pick an extreme number because you'll see it immediately. And then you'll know, okay, I'm going in the correct direction or not, or this is changing or it's not changing at all. So what we're gonna do is position this relative from the top of the game board circle a little bit lower. So we want to position the top of each one of our pieces a little bit lower. And remember, we're gonna either be working in pixels or percentages. In this case, we're trying to create a distance, so we're gonna work in pixels. So I'm gonna say it's from the top, let's put 1,000 pixels because we're gonna see this extreme change immediately. And remember our semicolons as well. That's how we end each one of these. If we can imagine like in writing, where we end with a period or a semicolon, if you're writing a sentence that has two parts to it. But in essence, each one of these lines here end with a semicolon. So let's give it a swing, folks. If I refresh, it looks like everything vanished, folks, but don't panic. If we scroll down, our pieces went very far because we put 1,000 pixels. But we know that we want it to position itself a little bit lower. So just and then we move the little bar there as well. Sorry, just trying to give us as much visual space here as possible. Awesome, cool, it's a little bit better. So instead of 1,000, why don't we maybe just shave 1 0 off of that? Refresh the page. Okay, cool. So that was a little bit too much. So let's try half of that. Let's see where that positions itself. We do 50. And now if I refresh this, looks like it's just about slab dab in the middle, which is awesome. Cool. Look at that, folks. We're getting closer and closer to where our end goal is. And again, like I said, if things aren't positioning themselves accordingly as well, remind yourself that you're here on a, what's today? Is it Wednesday? On a Wednesday night, learning how to make a game board on HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. And that is a skill in of itself. And give yourself credit for everything you're able to accomplish now. And remember that you'll be able to run this back and rewind my voice 1,000,000 times and then observe what part of it that you might be missing here. So this game piece sizes and details that we have is what is helping us position this relative to the game board behind it. And then we move the top portion of everything down a little bit. So again, just a reminder that my numbers might not be exactly your numbers based upon the distribution of your pixels on your computer. But again, this is where I encourage y'all to play with the numbers a little bit, because on your computer screen, it might be like 45, it might be 30. But again, you are the designer here of the canvas that we're coding / painting on, if I'm trying to make a metaphor analogy there, but you kind of get where I'm going with it. But choose what is actually going to look well positioned for you. So here on my screen, it is 50. That's putting everything in the middle, which is super interesting because the last time I did this, it was 25. But again, it depends on what screen it is that we're working on. Give ourselves a round of applause, folks, and let's keep cruising through this process. So next up, we are going to create some type of, I'm trying to think. I think we'll come back to this next part just so we can keep moving a little bit. I was gonna create the circle in the middle. That's a little bit more work with the dimensions of HTML, but I wanna kind of get the feel of when we're hovering over the pieces, we know that we might actually be clicking on them and getting that functionality going a little bit as well. Because now we have this circle that's containing the game piece. And now we have each one of these individual pieces as well. So we know that this dot here is because we use a class on each one of our HTML elements. So if I go over to our index.html, we have a class on every single one of our game piece div elements here. Looks like our top row. Oh no, we're good. That's cool, awesome. Everything there is just indented a little bit. Going to outdent that just so it matches up with our other pieces. Cool. Top row, and then we have our bottom row here. Outdent that. So in each one of these, we have a class. So it's pretty much saying all of these pieces are in the same class, same group. So we're styling them very similarly. So what we actually want to do now is get some type of functionality where we hover over each one of these pieces, is we're actually gonna get some feedback, some type of signal that we're hovering over these pieces. So for that, what we're gonna need to do is create what is called a hover effect in CSS. So because each one of these game pieces have a particular type of detail themselves, but this hover effect is something that you kind of would link on to this grouping. What we're going to do is create another CSS selector set here, connecting this process of each one of these game pieces details to a hover effect. So what I'm going to do is just copy this here, paste it. I'm just gonna lower that a little bit. And it at first is gonna look like the exact same thing, but what we're going to specify is that we actually want this to have a hover effect. So we're gonna drop the colon and write hover. And then we're going to open up our curly braces again here. And now what we actually want to do is decide what color this is going to show up as when we hover over it. So we get some type of signal that we're actually hovering over everything. And we want to know that we're hovering over this with our mouse cursor. So we're going to use the cursor keyword and put pointer on this so that it is now going to know, and we're going to see a little bit of a difference when I refresh the page, that there's some signal on each one of these. It's not going to highlight just yet, but if we look, it's a cursor, and then we get there, and then it becomes that pointer shape there. It's the regular triangular mouse cursor, then it becomes that pointer itself there. So from here, what we're going to do next is decide on a color. So let's say maybe we want to highlight this gray, and I'll just type that word exactly as is. And you can feel free to choose any color it is that you would like. Like I said, make this custom and personal to yourself. And if I refresh, let's see what's going on here. So we are not getting this hover effect showing up. Let me see what it is that I might be missing here. Oh, I didn't put a box shadow around each one of these pieces to begin with. So I'm just gonna go up to our actual game piece themselves. And what I'm going to do is just first give it a border. So I'm going to say border, and the style for that border, we're gonna make solid, and that's just gonna give us a solid line outside each one of our shapes. And then we're going to specify the width of each one of the borders. With that, we'll be able to say border dash width. And then, like I said, you can make an extreme change if you put like 100 pixels. Oh, I forgot to put the semicolon here for this top part. Cool. Now everything is matched up once again. If I refresh now, we see that all of our pieces, when we hover over them, are changing slightly gray, but they are now accompanied by gigantic border lines. So we might want to do something a little bit more delicate. Let's shave off 1, 0 from here first. If I refresh, we see that that is actually now creating this effect that when we hover our mouse, it actually looks like we're trying to click on each one of these pieces. Awesome. But now because of the additional outline of the border, it's offsetting our relative distance from the backboard itself. So here is where we would start to adjust this top number here. We saw that 50 was working before. Let's try to maybe cut that in half. And if I do 25 and refresh, now we got it positioned nicely as well. But every time we hover over one of these pieces, we see that it actually is creating this effect outside of it. So we went from an oblong oval and a bunch of very interesting looking shapes to now this thing that is a little bit representing what this game board starts to look like. Again, I'm moving a little bit at a quick pace, just trying to get to as much functionality as possible within everything so that folks can catch up there on that recording. But we see how each part of this is coming together. So again, if folks do have any experience with this, we know that there's a bunch of different ways that we can do what it is that I'm doing. I just try to outline things in a way that would be as digestible as possible in the approach. So we kind of see what each piece of our styling is doing and what it's actually affecting. So here is the thing that's actually making this hover effect highlight. Now that we actually have these border radiuses around this, because now there's actually something to show and highlight in each one of these pieces. Awesome, cool. So the next thing that we can do now that we actually have like some sense of highlighting each one of these pieces, let's talk about how it is that we can click on these and actually get some type of click effect going. Yeah, so everything we're doing is inline block at the moment. So that flex wrap was just cameoing that flex wrap and seeing that it started getting us to position stuff a little bit. But what we're actually doing is using our inline block to remove any excess space and in tandem with our position relative to allow things to come together and get rid of any excess space that was keeping them apart and position themselves relative to one another and relative to the actual game board piece, which is the black circle in the background there. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some JavaScript. And it's going to take a bit to build some concepts on top of one another. So we actually see how it is that we get some interactivity with what's happening on our actual game board. So, and awesome seeing folks helping each other out in the chat, as well as making progress. If not, it is okay, folks. I know I went a little bit quick today. So we highlight over our pieces, we see them. But when we click on them, we don't really get any actual feedback of any sort to know that we clicked on them. So some of this starts off in what's called the console. And the console is a place where we can see some data being logged or being displayed. And I actually use that keyword log because there's a function that we have in JavaScript called console log. If I say console, I'm referring to actually this element here. If I hover over it, we see that there's a word that says console. If we go to elements, that takes us to our HTML elements. But if we go to console, this is kind of that log tracker of what's going on our actual app. If there's an error, it's going to show up here in our console. Or if we log something ourselves to the console, so if we think about like a journal log where you're keeping track of some information, if we log something to the console, like maybe a smiley face, let's see what happens. You can either click the play button. If you're working inside the screen, I'll demonstrate that as well. You'll see the console here. If we click the play button, we got a smiley face in there. Since I'm working outside of this space here, if we actually go into the browser and I refresh here, we got a smiley face showing up in the console there. And that smile hopefully is also on your face, feeling accomplished and proud of what you've done so far. So just a quick recap, just a reminder that we're in our script.js file. And this is where we're actually writing our JavaScript. We're primarily doing our HTML and CSS prior to this, but now we're actually working a little bit on our JavaScript. So our JavaScript has some interesting functionality. So we're going to see some stuff that's a little bit similar to the CSS when we start talking about using our dots and hashtags to actually go and select or query for is the terminology that we would use in JavaScript to go and actually retrieve each one of those elements from our HTML page in the browser. But for starters, we have to talk a little bit about what a function is. And in this case, we've already used a function. This log function is something that we use to interact with the console so we can log messages to it ourselves. So here, if I copy and paste this, do a copy and paste. And if I actually maybe put like Sam here or something, and I go to the HTML page and I refresh, now we see a smiley face and we see Sam. Every time we log something to the console, we're seeing it show up there. This itself is a function. What is a function? I like to say our functions are things like a recipe or some type of order of instructions that we flow through to make something happen in a concise way. We can make our own functions. If I use the function keyword and I say function log Sam or something. And then in here, we would start some parentheses. This is where a function is actually taking in some dynamic information. So this is called our parameter or placeholder, as I like to call it. And in here, we'll make some curlies. And this is actually what's going to make the function be complete. So this function keyword declares that we're about to say that this thing is a function. This is the actual name of the function. And then here's where if this function is taking in any information, we pass it into there in our parameter scope. And then our curlies here are like the body of the function. It's containing everything that this function is doing. So for example, if I was to take this, and I'm just going to use the keyboard real quick and do Command X. If I were to take this and drop it into here, now if I want to actually see Sam log, I need to call this function is what it's called, or invoke this function is what it's called. So if I come into here and I refresh the page, we're going to notice that we don't see Sam. We only see the smiley face. This is because this function is never called. This function has a name, but if we don't call it ever by its name and invoke it is what it's called, which I'm going to demonstrate in a little bit, it won't ever actually activate itself. So it's like, for example, we all have a name, but if no one calls us, we don't know anyone is referring to us. If we want to call this function, we need to at least somewhere with respect to when we created it or declared it, we need to call its name. But the way that we more so specifically do this is with the parentheses. And this is actually called invocation or calling of a function in of itself. Or sometimes you might hear folks say like activating the function. So it's actually in use. So now if I refresh the page, we see the smiley face is showing up again and Sam is showing up again. If I copy this maybe and paste it 3 times over, we see that it's going to, if I refresh the page, log Sam 3 times to the console. So our functions are like a recipe, a list of things that it is that we need to do. And whatever we specify in these functions is what that thing is going to actually do. So there are functions we can write, and then there's functions that already exist. Those functions we don't have to declare. We can just actually call them. So I'm just going to highlight and comment this out real quick. So I'm just going to use the command / or control / if you're on Windows. And what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to use a function that we utilize to query and select stuff from our HTML page inside of our JavaScript page so we can have a connection to it. That is actually called, or one of the ways we can do this is called query selector. Query selector. And I can drop that in the chat as well. And query selector actually is a function that we have to call in relation to what we're querying for or searching for. So that is actually our HTML document. And as you look more into working with HTML and JavaScript and CSS, you'll hear terminology called the DOM, and that is the document object model. And we refer to that by using the word document here in our actual JavaScript file. So when we query select, this is a function similar to how console log is a function, and we passed it in some information to log to the console. So here, the document is the combination of everything that's showing up here on our web page, and our query selector is going to try and select from that page, similar to how our CSS was selecting from the HTML itself. So our query selector takes in an argument, which is what it's called when we're actually using a function. So when we make our own function, it has what is called a parameter, which is a placeholder. So if we were ever going to refer to something inside of that function, we would refer to it using whatever the parameter or placeholder it was that we passed into there. And when we actually use a function that's, or call a function that already exists, we're going to, those are called arguments. So the way I try to make that a little bit digestible is say it's arguable, whatever we can pass into that function. It's an argument. And trying to make this a little digestible. You know, some of these terminologies are things that you probably wouldn't hear on the day-to-day, but if you kind of analyze some of the verbiage in them, you start to find some commonalities and some familiarities with everything. So our document we're query selecting from, and query selector takes in as an argument whatever it is that we're trying to go and select by. We can query select by an ID, which we would then use the hashtag, or we can query select something by its class, which we would then use the dot. In our case, we're trying to query select using the IDs. We want to query for each one of these actual pieces so we know when they were clicked upon. So in order to do that as well, we can't just drop our hashtag and our dot in there. We need to wrap them in quotes like we saw here. And that data type itself is called a string when something is wrapped in quotes. So we know that we're going to go select each one of these divs based upon their ID. So we're using the hashtag. For example, if we want the first piece here, it has an ID of color red. So if I copy that and go over to our JavaScript file, we would need to drop a hashtag and then set it to the color red here. So once we actually do the selection process, if we don't save this to a variable, we won't be able to access it any other time after this. What is a variable, you ask? Let's take the verbiage a little bit. A variable. It is something that is able to vary in of what it is containing the information of. For example, one of the ways that we can create a variable that you might see a bunch when you're going and searching stuff on the interwebs is var, which we see kind of shorthands this variable process. So we can say var Sam equals, in quotes, Sam. And now if I want to maybe see the value of this, and we start to see that these are a little bit different. This isn't all lowercase. This is wrapped in those quotes, which becomes a string, which is kind of translates to like plain text, because this is actually a variable. For us as human beings looking at this, it's like, okay, they're all just words. But remember, we're speaking a programming language. We're communicating to the compiler itself. And the way that the compiler reads stuff is a little bit different from the way that we would read stuff. So it's reading this SAM and this SAM completely different. So var is something that's a little bit, I don't want to literally say outdated, because there are some cases where var still is in use in places that you might see. But just working over to let and const, which are ways that we'll declare stuff, but I think it's easier to kind of see that we're making a variable when we write var, because it looks like a shorthand to the word variable or variable. So if I wanted to take a look at that value, SAM, I would maybe log it to my console. So if I say console.log, we know this is the function we use to log stuff to the console, and I want to see what this variable actually is. If I refresh the browser, we got SAM showing up 3 times still. I think it might be a little bit lagged. Interesting. I'm going to still showing up 3 times. We commented out these functions here. Is my thing up to date? It looks like it's still trying to update itself, actually. Let me just refresh the page a little bit, because I see like the little loading thing flashing. All right, I need to be on the safe side, copy and paste everything. Yeah, it looks like it's a little bit lagged. So what we do here, refresh, let me reload the page. Let it come back together. Yeah, it looks like it might have been disconnecting here and there. Yeah, see, look, it's remembering when everything was still commented out. So I'm just going to lower the side over here, lower the files. And now if I'm just gonna highlight everything and paste what I had before. I copy and pasted before I refresh the page in case it lost anything that I typed. So I'm just going to come here and paste, and we should see, awesome, cool, exactly what we were looking at before. So now let me try to actually refresh the page, and hopefully it's communicating properly. There we go. And now we see that it's registered, and we're just seeing SAM show up 1 time because we logged it here. But again, variables don't have to match exactly what we wrote. For example, here, last person that I saw type was Carissa. My apologies if I pronounced your name wrong. So I'm just gonna write that name here, Carissa. So we can see that these don't have to always match. This variable name is a name we're giving this thing that is being assigned this value. So if I come here and I refresh, now we see that SAM is actually logging the value that we assigned it to. What is assignment? So when we hear the word assign, I always tell folks, think about an equal sign. And that's literally what it is that we're doing here. We're using an equal sign. We're using an equal sign to assign the results of this process to a variable called SAM, and then we're logging it. So something that you're going to see me using more than var, because var has some tendencies that make it accessible everywhere, and sometimes that might be a conflict. What you'll start to notice more often is declaring a variable using the word let or the word const. So let allows us to say this is what this is for now. So let's just say SAM equals Carissa. And then later on, we want to say that SAM actually equals Valerie, who's in the chat as well. Valerie. Try to spell properly. Valerie. Cool. So if we were to console log SAM again, let's see what that gives us. And we see that first, SAM equaled that string of Carissa. Then later we reassigned it. We use the equal sign again to change the value of that variable. We're gonna get to fun stuff again soon, folks. So we're working in our JavaScript file so that we can get connected to each one of these pieces. So when we click on them, we can actually see them showing up. But in order to do that, we need to hold on to that value using a variable. So similar to how we just played with these variables a little bit here, as an example, let's say we want to declare a variable and we want to call this red piece and set it equal to that process. We want to assign the variable red piece to this piece of code here that is selecting from the document, from our HTML, based upon its ID using the hashtag, something that has an ID of the color red. So after we do this process, and again, I would recommend to use the const word here. But next time we get a moment to extrapolate that, then I'll highlight that keyword there at that time. But so far we've looked at var and let. So I'm going to use let again just to follow one for one with the example that we just used. So what I'm going to do now is console log. So I'm going to console.log. We know that that is going to show up in our console. And I just want to confirm that we successfully selected for this piece, because what we want to do next is attach what's called an event listener to that piece so that we know what happens anytime we click on that piece. So in our console log here, I'm going to copy this red piece and paste it, and we should actually see that showing up now. So if I refresh the page, look at that. We got this div showing up. And we know that div came from our HTML file originally. So if I just refresh one more time, just so it gets its original form here. Down. Yeah, so it doesn't look like the div is loading synchronously enough to turn into its HTML presentation. But while we're here, we can take a look at all of the different properties here in this div that we created. So these are going to be super important when we're trying to interact with that div and maybe change its background color or something like that if we want something to flash, for one of these pieces to flash a little bit. So I'm just gonna collapse that. Something that we can actually do to help with this process of the piece loading when we console log it, if we take a quick pause and we go over to our HTML file, or our, I'm gonna open up our CSS file as well. We might need that in a bit as well. It's gonna, again, toggle these away. I'm gonna go to our HTML file, and something that we had situated from the beginning is we currently have our script tag at the end of our body tag here. So though this doesn't seem to necessarily be a problem, there's a concept called asynchronicity, which we can unpack a little bit as well. What is the word asynchronous? I just did the command / to make a comment block space. So asynchronous. Hopefully I spelled that correctly as well as I unpack this word a little bit. So we know that the word sync is in here, which means to happen at the same time. Usually when we unpack words and talk about their etymology, when there's an A in front of something, that means it's the opposite of it. So we can see that it's saying this is not in sync or not happening at the same time. So if I copy and paste this as well, I can show you there's another word hidden in here that can help us make a little bit more sense to this very technical mumbo jumbo term. And the word chronos is in that process as well. So anyone who's into mythology or anything like that knows chronos is, yes, like the whole like Titan and everything like that, but also the word itself means time. So asynchronous is pretty much, also as you in the chat, asynchronous is pretty much saying it is not at the same time. So with our script tag and our body tag, what happens is it loads after all of our elements load, but sometimes it's still a little bit lagged. So what I'm going to actually do is take our script tag and I'm going to do a cut and paste. So I'm going to do Command X and move it up to our actual head tag here. And what I'm going to do when I paste it in our head tag is I'm actually going to use a keyword called defer. that keyword means to put everything we wrote in our JavaScript file on hold, defer it, hold it off until every single one of these elements completely load. So that gives us the ability to help with that asynchronicity. So again, I just went to our body tag where we once had a div tag, a script tag that was here. I took it and did a copy and paste or a cut and paste, Command X, moved it up to our head tag. And I just pasted it there and used the deferred keyword to hold off on reading our JavaScript file until everything else loads. So if I refresh, there we go. Cool. So we see that asynchronicity is happening a little bit less now. So when we refresh, every now and then it's loading up as an object is what I would pretty much say, because each of these things under the hood are as such that data set. But when we load it properly, it actually shows up as that actual div element there. And we see that it has a unique identifier of color red again. So I know this might have not necessarily been as joyous and flashy as us creating these pieces, but this is super, super important when we talk about making games or doing anything that is going to rely on code for dynamic interaction. So as we're actually going and selecting now for that red piece using its ID, remember IDs will use that hashtag of color red. We see here, this has an ID of color red. And that's how we selected that. And then I just logged it to the console so we can see that we actually got it. Now what we're going to want to use is a function called add event listener. That function itself is going to make it so that we can add an event listener to this. So we know that in the event that something happens, we might want to create some type of functionality, some type of action there. This again rolls back to that analogy that I made of us putting on a show. So an event listener helps because in the event that something happens, we want some other functionality to occur. So if we think and we imagine we're at a show at a theater or something, most actors would know if the audience is clapping, or in the event that the audience claps, you might want to pause and not say your line until everyone can hear you. So in the event that there is a clapping happening, you might want to pause. In this case, in this show that we're putting on, in the event that someone clicks on that piece, we want to know that it was clicked on. This is where the heart of the remainder of our functionality is even going to come from. So this next function is called add event listener. So click on that. Add event listener is a function. So at some point, we're going to need to call it. It's a function that already exists. It's not a function that we need to write ourselves. We're going to connect this function to this red piece. We're going to start to realize eventually we're going to kind of start to rinse, repeat, and connect that. We're going to go select the next piece, connect this to that. So that each time we click on these individual pieces, we'll know that we clicked on these individual pieces. So from here, we have this red piece. We added this event listener to it. And add event listener is a function like we saw before. Query selector is a function. .log is a function that we call on the console. Add event listener is a function that we call on HTML elements. So this is why we had to first go and query for that HTML element and then add that event listener to it. Add event listener is a function and it actually takes in 2 arguments, similar to how these other functions take in an argument. We see that query selector is taking in 1 argument at this time. Console log is taking in 1 argument at this time. One thing we're passing between the parentheses. And our add event listener actually takes in 2 arguments minimum. So the first argument is the type of event that we're listening for. So if you hover over here, you start to see this little documentation that's explaining to you a little bit of how it is that we interact with our event listener function and the arguments that it takes in. The first argument it's taking into those parentheses is the type of event. We want to be listening in the event that the audience not claps, but in the event that the audience clicks, and specifically if they click on this red piece. So the type of event we're listening for or paying attention to for is a click event is what it's called. So when we click, we want something to happen. So the second argument that our event listener actually takes in is a function. So, and again, y'all should give yourselves a round of applause because I'm explaining to y'all concepts that we go through in this program over like a couple days, and I'm trying to make it as digestible as possible in this short period of time. But what we're going to do is make a function between the parentheses here. So what I'll do to make this a little bit more visual is I'm going to first write the function keyword here. And this function between the parentheses actually is not going to have a name like the function that we made before. This is called an anonymous function. If you think about the word anonymous, it's like something without a name. So we saw here on this function on line 25, we gave it a name of logsam. This function is not going to have a name because we only want to use it at this unique time. We could factor it out, as it's called, and make it a function that does have a name to call it. But I at least want y'all to first start getting that the two arguments for add event listener is a type of event, which is a click, and then a function. So what I'm gonna do is just copy and paste this. I'm gonna comment out the top just so I can rename this a little bit so we can have a reference. Cool. It went off the line a little bit. It's just bugging me. So I'm gonna write a function. So when we use the add event listener function, which is a function that already exists, we need to call it on an HTML element, which in this case, our red piece is saved to the process of us getting this red piece here. And now we want to know and listen for if someone clicks on this, we want to do something based upon this function here. So I'm going to copy and paste this as well again, comment out this one at the top and expand this a little bit. Because if I write into here, it's going to go off the line a little bit anyways. So what I'm going to do is expand this parentheses. And if it helps a little bit visually to see it like this, especially if you're just getting started off with JavaScript, feel free to do that. What you'll see more conventionally though, is our parentheses over at the side. So what we're gonna do is now start to space these out a little bit. So remember the first thing in our parentheses is our event type. Then we drop a comma so we can separate the next thing that we're passing between these two parentheses. And if I hit enter on this, and then hit enter on this, we can start to space these out a little bit and see them in a little bit more of a visual way. This is our event type is what it's called. This here is actually our function. You'll hear sometimes the verbiage of a callback function. That'll take a little bit of time for us to extrapolate, but just know that a callback function is just when a function takes in another function as an argument. But in this case, at a minimum, just remember add event listener takes in two pieces of information, two arguments. One is the event type as a string in quotes. The next thing is an actual function. So when we're working with events, we actually have something called an event object, which is a type of data structure itself. So in here, if we say the word event in this function's parentheses, that is letting us know what we want to refer to this as between these curlies here. So I'm just going to space this out a little bit, like when we made our first function below. This function here. Except remember, this function is anonymous. It doesn't yet have a name because we're only actually utilizing it between these two parentheses and we're not calling it again anywhere else. So if we actually log first, if we do a console.log and we log to the console this event object, copy this, paste this, what we'll actually see if I refresh this, I know this part probably wasn't a little bit too sparkly and enthusiastic, but like I said, these things are super important in anything that you're designing that's interactive, especially any type of game that you're going to be making. So if I refresh the page and I click on this, look at that. We have a pointer event showing up. I click again, it's keeping track of the fact that we clicked on this every time I click on this. This is a lot of data that's inside of here, but there's something we can do when we're interacting with objects. And what I'll do is I'll just highlight this and rename it event object. So y'all can remember this data structure, object. Anytime you're learning any other type of JavaScript, or anytime you hear the terminology used, this is an event object. This is what gives it each one of these pieces of text. This is called key value pairs. Hope folks are like taking notes. This is called key value pairs. What we want to actually do is refer to one of these keys so we can get to the value after the colon here. So the key we actually want to focus on in all of this information here is the target. Look at this. When I highlight over the target here, it's highlighting this div. It's doing that for reference, but we actually want to use what's called the dot notation, which is different than when we're using the dot for classes. When we're interacting with objects and we use what is called dot notation, it is going to give us access to whatever one of these keys we want to refer to. In this case, we want to refer to this key here called target. So the way I got all this to show up, just as a refresher, each one of these event objects, which are denoted with these curlies here, when we go into our console, I can click this little caret and it will show me all of the other keys. So when we are able to see the keys, we can decide which one we want to interact with. And I want to go and interact with that target, which we know is the thing we connected the event to begin with. It's the red piece, if we look here on line 24. So if on this event object, I'm going to do another console log. I just copied and pasted quickly. And if I say event object dot target, and if I refresh the page, so we see, remember this log is coming from line 20 here. So we see script.js line 20. It's highlighting to us that this console log is coming from line 20 above here. But now the next console log that's going to show up is from lines 32 and line 33. If I go over here and I click on this red button, look at what it's doing. It is logging the event object first, and then it's logging the results of the event object's target. So this is how we actually get access to this piece. So we know what we clicked upon. So something helpful as well is console log can take in multiple arguments, as it's called. Similar to how we saw add event listener can take in 2 arguments, a click and a function. Console log can take in a lot of arguments, but what I usually do to help with readability is I'll create an argument on the console log with that string, which we know is just using quotes, so that we can get some meaningful information in the console log. So when we have more than one argument, remember we have to separate them by a comma. So here, I'm just going to log a string, if you remember, like when we logged Sam. But instead of just writing Sam, I'm gonna put something a little bit more meaningful, like maybe this is the event object. And say, I hope it doesn't go off the line. And it did. I'm just gonna expand this a little bit just so it can wrap, so it's easier to see everything in one line. And now if I refresh the page and I click, look, our console log now has a little bit of a meaningful message here. This is the event object. Our next console log here, we're gonna give a meaningful message as well by giving it another argument, which is gonna be a string. We know strings are just plain text. And this is how it is that our compiler is able to read them. And it's plain text between quotes. So what we're going to put here is, this is the target. And it went off the line again. I was trying to write something short that will fit in the line. I'm just gonna expand this as well so that parenthesis wraps back again. And now if I refresh the page, we'll get a little bit more meaningful messages every time. I click on this red piece, it tells us this whole event object is paying attention in the event that our pointer clicks on that piece so we can keep track of it. So something a little bit entertaining and reassuring of why we want to do stuff like this is because if we have access to that event target, we can choose how we might want to change it. So here, if I, because we know that event target is also that red piece, so we can use that synonymously, but to follow the linear logic of what we're doing here, if we say the event object, let's assign it to another variable so that it makes a little bit more readable sense. So I'm going to use the let keyword, and I'm going to say, let the red piece clicked on equal that event object dot target. So if anyone is seeing that console is not defined, interesting there. Double check and make sure you spelled console correctly, because sometimes I'll misspell it all the time. Y'all saw I misspelled class and forgot an A. But that's something that I feel like would oftentimes cause that error message if you're console logging something and it's saying console is not defined. For example, well, let me finish this real quick and then I'll tag over to that error message. So we want to create a variable that is going to be referring to the red piece that we clicked on so we can do something with that red piece. So backtracking a little bit here, sometimes if the console is misspelled, I know sometimes I'll like maybe flip the S and the N, shout out that dyslexia, and the letters will scramble a little bit. And if I refresh, we might see that when I click now, we're getting an error message that says console is not defined. So if we're ever getting a message like this, just double check and make sure that console isn't misspelled in any type of way. That's usually a common way that that error message shows up. Or if you just write console and then try to invoke that, this will also cause an error message to show up telling us that console is not a function. So if you see that error message showing up, then you know that you might have just forgotten to put log there. So from here, we have access to this red piece. So what I can actually do to bring this back to a little bit more interactivity is I can change the background color of this red piece. So I can say, for example, the red piece clicked on, we can start to interact with the properties or the attributes of it. And we can say the red piece clicked on dot, use that dot notation to interact with the information inside of it, just like how we use dot notation to get the key value pairs out of that object. If we say red piece clicked on dot, I believe it should be a style, because we want to change the style of it. And then we say dot background color. And let's say we set that equal to white or something. So in this case, again, this is going to be referring to white as a variable unless we wrap it in quotes. So it knows we're referring to something that it's referencing of the color white or a string called white that it can translate, and not a variable called white. So if folks didn't put the quotes around this and I refresh, we might see an error message coming from here on line 37. When we look at script.js line 37 on the side there, the rightmost side, it's telling us we got an error message and it doesn't know what this white is. But if we were to wrap it in quotes, now we're not getting any error message. Now, if I click on this white piece, look at that. The background color changed to white. But we might not want that to stay as white, because now how will we ever know that that's the red piece if we change that for every single one of these functions? So in this case, we want to probably create some functionality to return it back to its original color. So Tim just want to do a quick check-in for time. Try to move as quickly through things as possible. Awesome. So I'm gonna keep cruising through.
Sorry. Yeah, it looks like we are right at time, 7:40. Yeah.
Cool. So I guess a good next challenge for y'all to continue to do here is uh, try to connect all of the other pieces to this click event. What I'll actually do for folks, because for now, this portion was just a part 1 to part 2. If there are any other parts to follow after this, you get a notification about that. But what I'll actually do is I'm going to drop into the chat the link to actually get to the finished product here. As you'll start to see, I kind of streamlined the process a little bit, and I didn't include that center piece just so we can start to get to some of the functionality, because the functionality actually takes a bit of logic to get through. But what I'll do is provide this link so that folks can take a look at that code base and reference that as well. And what I'll do as well is, let me just each one of these and just refresh the page. And it's automatically in the next HTML, which is okay. I'm just going to drop this link in the chat so y'all can see the finished products functionality. And then I'll also relay this to Tim as well, so that maybe this can be included in the email so y'all can see it. But just for a quick demonstration, I know that we've been getting a lot of verbiage and mumbo jumbo going, but what it is that we're pretty much working towards trying to build is something like this. We can kind of see where it is that I was streamlining the process a little bit, just so we can start talking about those click event functionalities here. But the way that I pretty much have this set up is if we click start, it is flashing each one of those pieces. You kind of see where we're going with this of once we click on this, it turns white. But like I said, when you're making a game, a lot of this logic is super important. So if folks are already taking a look at that public REPL IT link and you go and click on the JavaScript file and scroll through, you'll see a whole bunch of logic that I wrote. But hopefully from what it is that we started doing here today together, you're able to comprehend what these event listeners are doing and how it's making this dynamic functionality actually happen, so that when we are interacting with the actual finished product of the game itself, when we click the start button, it's pretty much just going to, the way I have it designed, it's just going to re-flash whatever it is that is being selected. I currently have a randomizer in there as well. I'll try to go through and pseudocode some comments so y'all can follow along there also. Every time I refresh, it's going to choose a different pattern. And it would have took some time to work up to this, but if we try to actually keep track of what pattern it is, so far we have what it looked like. Blue was just the first one that showed up. So now it's blue and yellow, and we see the score going up. Blue, yellow. So blue, yellow, red. We see our score going up there as we follow the correct pattern. So feel free to take a look at this finished code base. Anyway, for the last parts of what we are missing to be included in the YouTube video. Yeah, so I'm gonna send this link over to Tim as well and the marketing team, so that when that email with the recording is sent out, you also get this finished code base. So y'all can take a look at it and kind of mess around with it a little bit and cross-reference where we were at to where it is that we're aiming to get to. But there's a lot of logic that goes into this entire process here. And if I bring this screen over here and click on this JS file, we can kind of take a look at some of the stuff that's going on in here. So we see that we have our green button connected to a query selector. We have our red button connected to a query selector. There's a bunch of other functions in here as well that's actually allowing for everything to happen. This we're using for the randomization every time I refresh the page, and that connects over to the function that we have that's going to randomize everything so that you can actually choose from it. So take some time and flow through this code base as a reference. And hopefully with the stuff that we've been able to talk about, folks are able to comprehend where it is that we're aiming to get to. I'll copy and paste that again for that finished product so folks can take a look at it. But thank you again, folks. It's always a blast and awesome hanging out with everyone, seeing everyone participate with one another in the chat and help one another and support one another. Again, my name is Sam. I'm the lead software engineering instructor at Flatiron School, and it has been a pleasure, folks. Again, we kind of see what goes into making these games. So keep learning up, keep practicing, and get that functionality going, folks. I know for a fact that you can do it. Let's go, team. And let me just stop the screen share.